I'm Stephanie Montgomery, 34, and 6 months ago, I inherited a beautiful beach house in the Hamptons from my Aunt Meredith. It was supposed to be my sanctuary, my escape from Manhattan's chaos. Then came that fateful phone call from my sister Heather. "Perfect. Your beach house is empty for 6 months, we're moving in." Those words turned my life upside down. Walking into my own property and feeling like an intruder was something I never expected. Family and boundaries, I learned the hard way how quickly one can destroy the other. Before I tell you how I went from beach house owner to unexpected landlord, drop a comment telling me where you're watching from, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family drama and learning to stand up for yourself. My life in Manhattan was the definition of organized chaos. I worked as a marketing executive for a major cosmetics brand, lived in a small but stylish apartment in Chelsea, and poured every ounce of energy into climbing the corporate ladder. My colleagues often joked that I was married to my job, and they weren't entirely wrong. After my divorce 2 years ago, a mutual decision after realizing we'd grown into different people, I doubled down on my career. I had no children, no pets, not even a houseplant that required regular attention. What I did have were deadlines, client meetings, and a reputation for delivering results no matter what it took. Weekends often found me at my laptop, takeout containers scattered around, as I fine-tuned presentations or analyzed market trends. It wasn't balanced, but it was my life, and I had made peace with it. Then came the call about Aunt Meredith. My mother's sister had always been my favorite relative, eccentric, independent, and generous with both her time and wisdom. She never married, traveled extensively, and made a small fortune in real estate investments. Growing up, I spent many summers at her Southampton beach house, collecting seashells and listening to her adventures abroad. The beach house was a stunning 3-bedroom Cape Cod-style home, just 2 blocks from the ocean. It had wraparound porches, a sun-drenched kitchen, and windows that captured the perfect cross-breeze on summer evenings. The property came with a small garden that Meredith had filled with lavender and hydrangeas, and a detached garage that housed her vintage Volkswagen Beetle. When her lawyer informed me that I'd inherited both the house and the car, I was overwhelmed. It was a connection to those carefree childhood summers and a gift I never expected. My initial plan was simple: use it occasionally on weekends, maybe spend a few weeks there in the summer, and potentially rent it out during peak season to cover the property taxes and maintenance. What complicated matters was my family situation. My younger sister Heather had always lived a more chaotic life than mine. While I was methodical and cautious, she was spontaneous and free-spirited. Those qualities made her fun to be around but often led to practical problems. At 31, she had 2 children, Emma, age 8, and Liam, age 10, and was struggling financially after her divorce last year. Her ex-husband paid child support but irregularly, and Heather had bounced between administrative jobs, never quite finding her professional footing. Her latest setback came when the startup she worked for downsized, leaving her unemployed 3 months ago. Her current boyfriend Mark, a web developer who had recently been laid off from his tech company, had moved in with her and the kids in their small apartment in Queens. Our parents, retired and living in Florida, worried constantly about Heather's situation. They regularly sent money and offered advice, which Heather alternatively accepted and resented. The dynamic between us had always been predictable: Heather would find herself in trouble, and I would help fix things. I co-signed her first apartment lease, loaned her money for car repairs, and once paid for a lawyer when her ex-husband threatened to sue for custody during their bitter divorce. Despite our different approaches to life, I loved my sister and my niece and nephew dearly. Emma was artistic and sensitive, constantly drawing or creating stories. Liam was a science enthusiast with an encyclopedic knowledge of marine life. They were bright spots in my often solitary existence, and I treasured the weekends when they would visit me in the city. After inheriting the beach house, I was swamped with a major product launch at work. 60-hour weeks became the norm, and I barely had time to process Aunt Meredith's passing, let alone visit Southampton. I hired a property management company to check on the house weekly, arranged for basic maintenance, and planned to properly assess the property once the launch was complete. I spoke to Heather a few times during this period, mentioning the inheritance and my vague plans for the property. She expressed excitement about the possibility of summer visits but never suggested anything more. In retrospect, I should have noticed her unusual interest in the property details, questions about the alarm system, whether I'd changed the locks, if the neighbors were year-round residents. But hindsight, as they say, is 20/20. 6 weeks after the inheritance, I finally cleared my calendar for a weekend visit to the beach house. I needed to catalog furniture, check for any immediate repair needs, and simply spend time connecting with this unexpected gift from Aunt Meredith. I packed light, planning to pick up groceries in town, and left Manhattan early on a Friday morning, excited for my first real break in months. The drive to Southampton was therapeutic. As the urban landscape gave way to lush greenery and glimpses of coastline, I felt the tension in my shoulders begin to dissolve. I rolled down the windows, letting the salt air fill the car, and allowed myself to imagine peaceful weekends in this new chapter of my life. Maybe I'd finally learn to cook properly in that spacious kitchen. Perhaps I'd take up painting on the porch, something Aunt Meredith had always encouraged. For the first time in months, I felt like I could breathe. That sense of peace lasted precisely until I turned onto Bayberry Lane and approached the house. A navy blue minivan I didn't recognize sat in the driveway, alongside a sedan that looked suspiciously like Mark's Toyota. My first thought was that perhaps the property managers had sent someone for maintenance, but as I pulled up behind the vehicles, a tricycle and several beach toys scattered across the lawn told a different story. I sat in my car for several minutes, trying to process what I was seeing. The curtains in the front windows had been changed from Aunt Meredith's cream linen to something with a bold floral pattern. A basketball hoop that definitely hadn't been there before was mounted above the garage door. My confusion quickly morphed into a sickening realization as I spotted Emma riding her bike around the side of the house. On shaky legs, I approached the front door. Before I could even reach for my keys, the door swung open to reveal Heather, dressed in yoga pants and one of Aunt Meredith's old aprons. "Steph," she exclaimed, her expression flickering between surprise and what I now recognize as guilt. "We weren't expecting you. Why didn't you call first?" The absurdity of her question, why hadn't I called before visiting my own property, left me momentarily speechless. I stepped past her into the foyer, where the familiar antique console table was now covered with school notices, mail, and car keys. The walls, once adorned with Meredith's collection of local artwork, now displayed my niece's framed drawings. "Heather," I managed finally, "what's going on? Why are you here? And what happened to Aunt Meredith's things?" "Aunt Steph." Liam's voice called as he bounded down the stairs, followed closely by Mark, who at least had the decency to look uncomfortable. "Hey, Stephanie," he said, shifting his weight from one foot to another. "Great place you've got here." The next 30 minutes were a blur of explanations and justifications. Heather and Mark had lost their apartment due to falling behind on rent. With nowhere to go and 2 children to house, they'd remembered my empty beach house. It was just sitting there, Heather explained, and they knew I was too busy with work to use it. They'd only planned to stay for a few weeks while they figured things out. "But that was almost a month ago," I pointed out, trying to keep my voice level as Emma and Liam watched wide-eyed from the doorway to the kitchen. "You never asked me, Heather. You never even mentioned you were struggling with rent. Would you have said yes if I asked?" Heather countered, her chin lifting in that defiant way I'd known since she was a toddler. "You were so busy with your launch, and we needed immediate help. The apartment management was threatening eviction, and the kids were terrified." Mark chimed in then, putting his arm around Heather. "We were desperate, Stephanie. We didn't want to burden you with our problems when you were dealing with so much at work. We figured we'd be in and out before you even needed to use the place." I looked around at the transformed space, at the family photos now displayed on the mantel, at the children's shoes lined up by the door, at the whiteboard calendar on the refrigerator visible from the hallway. This wasn't a temporary crash pad, they had moved in completely. "The kids love it here," Heather said softly, following my gaze. "Emma's made friends with the girl next door, and Liam's been collecting specimens from the beach for a science project." It's the first time since the divorce that they've seemed really happy. And there it was, the emotional hook I could never resist. My anger deflated slightly as I watched Emma whisper something to her brother, both of them clearly anxious about the adult tension in the room. "Can we stay, Aunt Stephanie?" Liam asked, stepping forward with determined bravery. "I promised to help with chores. I already take out the trash every night and help clean up after dinner." I rubbed my temples, feeling a headache building. "Let's talk in the kitchen," I told Heather and Mark, deliberately keeping my voice light for the children's benefit. Once out of earshot, I expressed my feelings more directly. I was hurt they hadn't asked, frustrated by the presumption, and concerned about the legal implications of them living in a property they had no right to occupy. Mark mentioned they'd told the neighbors they were house-sitting for me, which added dishonesty to the list of issues. "We need to figure something out," I said finally. "You can't just live here indefinitely. This isn't your house, and I have plans for it." After much discussion and several near arguments, we reached a reluctant compromise. They could stay for 1 month, no longer, while actively looking for affordable housing. They would pay the utilities while staying there, return any items of Aunt Meredith's they had moved, and ask permission before making any further changes to the house. I would come down every weekend to check on the property and help with the housing search. As I drove back to the city that Sunday evening, a sense of unease followed me. I had established boundaries, but something in Heather's too quick agreement made me suspect she had no intention of honoring our timeline. Still, I told myself, they were family. They needed help. And it was only for a month. I had no idea how naive I was being. 2 months later, I stood in what had once been Aunt Meredith's carefully curated living room, now dominated by an enormous sectional sofa I'd never seen before. The elegant sea glass collection that had lined the bay window was gone, replaced by a gaming console and tangled controllers. The walls, previously a subtle sand color, had been repainted a bold teal that Heather described as bringing the ocean inside. "Don't you think it brightens the place up?" she asked, seemingly oblivious to my stunned expression. The old color was so drab and dated. It was my 4th visit since discovering them living in the house, and each time I arrived, more of Aunt Meredith's home had disappeared, replaced by Heather and Mark's vision of domestic life. The carved wooden sea turtles from Meredith's travels to the Galapagos? Stored in the attic because they were too fragile with kids around. The vintage nautical maps? Replaced by framed movie posters that Mark collected. "Where are Aunt Meredith's things going?" I asked, trying to keep my voice even. "We agreed you wouldn't make changes without discussing them first." Heather waved dismissively. "Everything's carefully packed away, Steph. Don't worry so much. We're just making the space livable for a modern family." The promised 1 month had come and gone with no mention of moving plans. When I brought it up during my previous visit, Heather had explained that the rental market was brutal, that they needed to save a bit more for security deposits, that uprooting the children during the school year would be disruptive. Each excuse was designed to pull at my heartstrings while pushing the timeline further back. My work situation had become even more demanding. Our successful product launch had led to a potential promotion and responsibility for an international expansion. 16-hour days were now standard, with conference calls to Tokyo at midnight and Paris at dawn. The few moments I had to check in with Heather were usually rushed phone calls that she often didn't answer, forcing me to leave voicemails that went unreturned. On the rare occasions I did reach her, the conversation inevitably turned to some exciting improvement they were planning for our beach house. The possessive pronoun grated on my nerves, but I was too exhausted to correct her each time. One Tuesday evening in July, I received a call from Mrs. Abernathy, the elderly neighbor whose cottage adjoined the eastern property line. She was concerned about noise from another party at my sister's house. This was news to me. I knew nothing of any parties, previous or planned. "I know young people need to socialize," she said kindly, "but perhaps your sister could ask her guests to park on your property rather than blocking my driveway. My doctor makes house calls on Wednesdays." After assuring Mrs. Abernathy I'd address the issue, I immediately called Heather. When she didn't answer, I tried Mark's phone. After 6 rings, he picked up, the sound of music and laughter nearly drowning out his voice. "Hey, Stephanie. What's up?" he shouted over the noise. "What's up is that I'm hearing about parties from the neighbors," I replied, pacing my small apartment. "Mark, we had an agreement about respecting the property and the neighborhood." "It's just a little housewarming," he said, his words slightly slurred. "Heather wanted to show off our new place to some friends." "It's not your place," I said sharply. "And what do you mean housewarming? You're supposed to be looking for your own place, not settling in permanently." The call ended with Mark promising to keep the noise down and Heather vaguely agreeing to call me the next day to discuss things when the timing was better. That call never came. During my next weekend visit, I discovered Mark had set up a full home office in the master bedroom, Aunt Meredith's bedroom, which I had specifically asked them not to use. Dual monitors, a standing desk, and a professional microphone setup dominated the space. "I've been taking on remote consulting clients," he explained with pride. "Having a professional space to work from has really helped me land some big fish. One guy is paying me $10,000 for a complete website overhaul." "That's great," I said carefully, "but we agreed you wouldn't use this room. And more importantly, if you're making good money again, why haven't you started looking for your own place?" The pattern continued. Each boundary I set was systematically ignored or renegotiated. When I requested they not use Aunt Meredith's china collection for everyday meals, I returned to find it completely packed away because it was taking up valuable cabinet space. When I asked that they maintain the garden as Meredith had designed it, I arrived to find half the plants replaced with a vegetable patch because growing our own food is healthier for the kids. My relationship with my sister deteriorated with each interaction. The easy conversation we once shared became strained. She grew defensive at the slightest question about their living situation, often bringing up childhood perceived slights or accusing me of being selfish with all the space for just one person. 4 months in, I discovered through a chance conversation with a local shop owner that Heather had been introducing herself as the co-owner of the property. When confronted, she dismissed it as a misunderstanding. "I just said we share the house, which we do right now," she explained with feigned innocence. People make assumptions. The financial impact was becoming significant. The utilities had tripled with 4 full-time residents, and despite our agreement, the bills somehow always ended up with past due notices before I discovered them. Repairs from parties in general were accumulated. A broken banister from kids playing, water damage in the bathroom from a small overflow situation, a cracked window from neighborhood kids playing baseball. Each time I visited, I felt less like the owner and more like an unwelcome guest. My belongings were moved to make room for theirs. The guest room I stayed in gradually transformed into a storage space for their overflow items. Heather began forgetting to tell me about plans that might impact my visits, leaving me to discover a house full of her friends' families during what was supposed to be a quiet weekend to work on my presentation. 5 months into their stay, I arrived to find Emma and Liam settled into a routine that broke my heart. They talked excitedly about their new school friends, their sports teams, their plans for Halloween in the neighborhood. They had put down roots, exactly as Heather had intended. Uprooting them now would make me the villain, and she knew it. The property expenses mounted. Beyond utilities, there were landscaping costs, pool maintenance, and a growing list of repairs. I had planned to cover these with occasional rentals, but with Heather's family and permanent residence, that income never materialized. Instead, my savings were steadily draining while my time to enjoy the property was non-existent. With each passing week, I felt my connection to Aunt Meredith's legacy slipping away. This home that was meant to be my sanctuary, my connection to cherished memories, was being systematically erased and replaced with someone else's vision. My resentment grew alongside my sense of powerlessness. Something had to give. 6 months to the day after finding Heather and her family in my beach house, I was scheduled to fly to Chicago for a major client presentation. The expansion project I'd been leading was moving into its next phase, and this meeting would determine whether I received the promotion I'd been working toward for years. My bags were packed, my presentation rehearsed to perfection, and my anxiety at an all-time high. Then came the call from my boss at 5:30 a.m. The Chicago team has a COVID outbreak, she explained. We're postponing until next week. Take the day off, Stephanie. You've earned it. After months of preparation and stress, the sudden schedule change left me disoriented. On impulse, I decided to drive out to Southampton. I hadn't visited in 3 weeks due to work demands, and I thought perhaps a quiet day by the ocean might help reset my perspective before the rescheduled presentation. I didn't call ahead. Looking back, I'm not sure if that was an oversight due to exhaustion or a subconscious decision to see what was really happening when they didn't have time to prepare for my arrival. The sight that greeted me as I turned onto Bayberry Lane stopped me cold. 3 construction trucks lined the street in front of the house. A dumpster filled with debris sat in the driveway, and the front yard was strewn with lumber and building materials. The front door stood wide open, and the sound of power tools shrieked from inside. I parked haphazardly and ran into the house, ducking under a plastic sheet hanging in the entryway. The interior was unrecognizable. The wall between the kitchen and dining room had been partially demolished. The original hardwood floors that Aunt Meredith had lovingly maintained were covered with protective paper, marked with footprints and coffee stains. A team of workers moved efficiently through the chaos, taking direction from Mark, who stood in the center of the former kitchen holding a blueprint. "What the hell is happening here?" I demanded, my voice cutting through the mechanical noise. Work screeched to a halt as every head turned toward me. Mark's expression shifted from surprise to a strange sort of defensiveness I hadn't seen before. "Stephanie," he said, handing the blueprints to a contractor and walking toward me. "We weren't expecting you today." "Clearly," I replied, my eyes scanning the destruction of my property. "What is all this? Who authorized this construction?" Before Mark could answer, Heather emerged from upstairs, her face flushing when she saw me. "You're supposed to be in Chicago," she said, accusation in her tone as if I'd somehow tricked her. "Meeting was postponed." "Now answer my question. What is going on here?" Heather exchanged a look with Mark before forcing a bright smile. "We're making some improvements." Surprise! The kitchen was so outdated, and with Mark's new clients, we finally had the money to do this place justice. "Do this place justice?" I repeated, my voice rising despite the workers pretending not to listen. "This isn't your house to improve, Heather. You were supposed to be gone 5 months ago." Mark stepped forward, his confidence bolstered by Heather's presence. "We've put almost $30,000 into these renovations, Stephanie. That's a significant investment in your property. You should be thanking us." The number hit me like a physical blow. 30,000? Where did you get that kind of money? An uncomfortable silence fell before Heather admitted, "We used your contractor account at Anderson's Hardware and Colonial Building Supply. They had it on file from when Aunt Meredith used them. We just told them we were authorized to continue the existing account." The room seemed to spin as the implications sank in. They had not only taken over my house but had now indebted me for renovations I never approved. I pushed past Heather toward the stairs, needing to see what other surprises awaited. The second floor was largely intact but transformed in smaller ways: new paint, different fixtures, rearranged furniture. As I moved from room to room in shocked silence, Heather followed, alternating between defensive explanations and attempts to highlight the improvements. In what had been Aunt Meredith's home office, I found enrollment paperwork for the local school district spread across the desk. Next year's enrollment, for the fall semester still months away. "You enrolled the kids in school here? For next year?" I asked, holding up the forms with trembling hands. "Were you ever planning to leave?" Heather's facade finally cracked. "Why should we leave? The kids are thriving here. Emma's anxiety is finally under control, Liam's grades have never been better. We're finally making a stable home for them after all the chaos of the divorce." "By stealing my house?" I shot back. "By making financial commitments in my name?" "This is fraud, Heather." "It's family helping family," Mark interjected from the doorway. "The house was just sitting empty most of the time anyway. It's not like you were using it. That doesn't make it yours. I shouted, years of accumulated frustration finally boiling over. Nothing gives you the right to take what isn't yours. The argument escalated rapidly, spiraling from the immediate situation into decades of sibling history. Heather brought up our childhood, how I always had the nicer things, how our parents paid for my college but she had to work through hers, how I had my perfect city life while she struggled as a single mother. You've always had everything handed to you, she cried, tears streaming down her face. One time, just once, I needed something big from you, and you can't even share. Share? I laughed bitterly. You didn't ask to share anything. You took over my property, changed it without permission, ran up debt in my name, and planned a permanent life in a house that isn't yours. That's not sharing, that's stealing. Emma and Liam appeared in the hallway, drawn by the shouting. Their frightened expressions cut through my anger momentarily, but Mark's next statement reignited it instantly. The kids consider this their home now, he said, putting his hands on their shoulders. You'd really throw children out of their home? What kind of person does that? It was the emotional manipulation I'd fallen for repeatedly, but this time, seeing it used so blatantly while standing amid the physical destruction of my inheritance, something in me hardened. I'm leaving, I said, my voice deadly calm. When I come back, it won't be alone. I walked out without another word, ignoring Heather's calls behind me. In my car, the tears finally came, tears of rage, betrayal, and overwhelming loss. I checked into a hotel in Southampton that night, unable to face the 3-hour drive back to Manhattan in my emotional state. As I stared at the ceiling in the anonymous room, I realized I had finally reached my breaking point. This wasn't just about a house anymore, it was about whether I would continue to be exploited by the people who were supposed to love me most. The next morning, I sat in the office of Patricia Goldstein, a real estate attorney recommended by the hotel concierge. Her office was small but immaculate, with a view of the harbor that would typically have been calming. Today, however, nothing could ease the knot of anxiety in my stomach as I explained my situation. Unfortunately, Ms. Montgomery, this isn't uncommon, Patricia said after listening to my story. Family property disputes are some of the most emotionally complex cases we handle. The good news is that legally, this is quite straightforward. You are the sole owner of the property, and your sister and her family are, at this point, unauthorized occupants. You mean squatters, I said, the word tasting bitter in my mouth. Legally speaking, yes. The fact that you initially gave verbal permission for a temporary stay complicates things slightly, but their refusal to leave after the agreed-upon timeframe shifts their status. She leaned forward. What exactly do you want to happen here, Ms. Montgomery? The question was simple but profound. What did I want? Part of me still loved my sister and her children, still remembered the brief moments of genuine family warmth we'd shared in the house. But another part, the part that had been taken advantage of repeatedly, knew this pattern would never end unless I took decisive action. I want them out, I said finally. I want my property back, I want repairs for any damages, and I want to establish clear boundaries with my sister that will actually be respected. Over the next hour, Patricia outlined my options. We could proceed with a formal eviction notice, giving Heather and Mark 30 days to vacate the premises. She advised documenting the unauthorized changes and getting estimates for restoring the property. Most importantly, she suggested I file a police report regarding the fraudulent use of my contractor accounts. The police report may seem harsh, she acknowledged, but it creates an official record and may be necessary for insurance purposes. It also demonstrates that you're serious about addressing the situation. I left her office with a folder of paperwork, a list of next steps, and a heaviness in my heart that no legal strategy could lighten. This wasn't a simple tenant dispute, this was my family. Yet Patricia's parting words resonated with me. Family can be our greatest support or our greatest weakness. Don't let love become a weapon used against you. That afternoon, I called my company's HR department and requested a week of emergency personal leave. My boss, aware of only the vaguest outlines of my family's situation, was surprisingly supportive. The Chicago presentation can wait another few days, she assured me. Take care of what you need to handle. Next came one of the hardest steps, a session with Dr. Levine, my therapist in Manhattan, conducted via video call from my hotel room. For the past 3 years, I'd been working with her on establishing healthier boundaries, particularly with Heather. Now I had to admit how completely those boundaries had collapsed. It sounds like you're finally reaching the limits of what you're willing to tolerate, she observed after I recounted the renovation discovery. That's not failure, Stephanie. That's growth. We discussed the guilt I felt about potentially disrupting my niece and nephew's lives, the fear that my family would permanently turn against me, and the deep-seated belief that as the successful sister, I was somehow obligated to continually sacrifice for Heather. Your success doesn't create an obligation to be taken advantage of, Dr. Levine reminded me. And consider the model you're creating for Emma and Liam. Do you want them to learn that taking what isn't theirs is acceptable if they frame it as need? Over the next 3 days, I assembled the pieces of my plan. I researched affordable housing options in Queens and Long Island, eventually finding a 3-bedroom apartment in a decent school district that was currently offering 2 months free on a year's lease. I calculated what I could afford to offer as financial assistance for their fresh start, enough to cover first and last month's rent plus security deposit, once they found a suitable place. I documented everything about the house's current state, taking detailed photographs of the unauthorized construction and creating a spreadsheet of estimated repair costs. I contacted the contractors directly, discovering that the improvements were far more extensive than what I'd seen. They had plans for a complete kitchen renovation, a master bathroom overhaul, and converting the garage into a home gym. The contractor, embarrassed about the misunderstanding, shared copies of all the approved plans, signed by Mark with a poor imitation of my signature. The total projected cost, much of which had already been charged to my account, $47,235. The evidence in hand, I filed the police report as Patricia had suggested. The officer who took my statement was understanding but direct. This is a clear case of fraud, Ms. Montgomery, regardless of family ties. Do you want to press charges? I hesitated. Not yet, I said finally. I want to try to resolve this without criminal charges if possible. But I need the report for my records. With the legal groundwork laid, I faced the most difficult call, to my parents. I had avoided telling them about the situation, knowing they would be caught in the middle. Now, with eviction papers being prepared, I couldn't delay any longer. My father answered, his voice brightening when he realized it was me. Stephanie. What a nice surprise. Your mother and I were just talking about planning a visit up your way this summer. The casual normality of his greeting nearly broke my resolve. How could I tell them that their daughters were locked in a property dispute that might permanently fracture the family? But as I struggled to find the right words, my father's tone shifted. Is this about Heather and the beach house? He asked quietly. Because she called last night talking about renovations, and something didn't sit right. Relief washed over me at not having to start from the beginning. Yes, I admitted. It's much worse than you probably realize. I laid out the whole situation, the initial discovery, the broken agreements, the escalating changes, and finally, the unauthorized construction and financial fraud. I tried to keep my tone factual rather than accusatory, but the emotion crept in despite my efforts. To my surprise, my father's first response was, "I'm so sorry you've been dealing with this alone, Stephanie. I wish you had told us sooner." My mother's reaction, when she joined the call, was more complicated. Eviction papers? Stephanie, that seems so extreme. Their family. Surely there's another way to handle this. I've tried other ways for 6 months, Mom, I replied, fighting to keep the frustration from my voice. Every agreement has been broken, every boundary crossed. What would you suggest I do? The conversation continued for over an hour. My father largely supported my position, acknowledging that Heather's behavior was unacceptable regardless of her circumstances. My mother wavered between understanding my perspective and worrying about Heather and the children. We're flying up tomorrow, my father announced eventually. This needs to be addressed face to face, as a family. As I ended the call, I felt a strange mixture of dread and relief. The situation was finally coming to a head. I had done everything I could to prepare, legally, financially, and emotionally. Now came the hardest part, the confrontation that would either begin the healing process or permanently alter my family's dynamics. That night, I returned to Dr. Levine's words, "Your compassion is a strength, but not when it's exploited." For the first time in my adult life, I was choosing to prioritize my own well-being over Heather's demands. The realization was both terrifying and strangely liberating. The morning of the confrontation dawned bright and clear, a perfect Southampton summer day that contrasted sharply with the storm brewing inside me. Patricia Goldstein had suggested having the eviction notice served professionally, but I had insisted on delivering it personally. This wasn't just a legal proceeding, it was a necessary recalibration of my most important relationships. My parents' rental car pulled into the hotel parking lot at precisely 10 a.m. My father, ever punctual, looked older than when I'd last seen him at Christmas, the strain of family conflict etched in the new lines around his eyes. My mother hugged me tightly, whispering, "We'll get through this together," though I wasn't entirely sure which outcome she was hoping for. Patricia arrived minutes later, professional in a navy suit despite the summer heat, a folder of documents tucked under her arm. We had agreed she would remain largely silent unless legal clarification was needed, her presence serving mainly as a signal of how seriously I was taking the situation. The drive to the beach house was silent, each of us lost in our own thoughts. As we approached Bayberry Lane, I felt a familiar tightness in my chest, the same anxiety that had accompanied every visit over the past 6 months. But today was different. Today, I wasn't arriving as the accommodating sister or the reluctant landlord. Today, I was reclaiming what was mine. Heather answered the door in mid-laugh, clearly expecting someone else. Her smile vanished when she saw our assembled group, her eyes darting nervously from me to our parents to Patricia with her unmistakable leather portfolio. "Mom? Dad? What are you doing here?" she asked, ignoring me entirely. "And who is this?" "We need to talk, Heather," my father said firmly. "All of us. As a family. Can we come in, please?" The living room had been partially restored since my last visit, the construction debris cleared away, though the missing wall between it and the kitchen remained an open wound in the house's architecture. Mark appeared from the backyard, his casual demeanor faltering when he registered our parents' serious expressions and the unfamiliar woman in professional attire. "What's going on?" he asked, moving to stand beside Heather in a united front. I took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Patricia Goldstein, my attorney," I said, making the introduction directly. "She's here because we have legal matters to discuss regarding your occupancy of my property." Heather's face flushed with anger. "You brought a lawyer to a family discussion? Are you serious right now? This stopped being just a family discussion when you committed fraud by using my accounts without permission," I replied evenly. "But yes, we're here as family first, to give you the opportunity to handle this with dignity." Patricia quietly placed the folder on the coffee table and opened it to reveal the eviction notice on top. "This is a formal notice to vacate the premises within 30 days, she explained, her tone professional but not unkind. "Ms. Montgomery has asked me to explain that she is legally within her rights to demand immediate departure given the circumstances, but she's offering the full 30-day period out of consideration for your children." Mark grabbed the document, scanning it with increasingly agitated movements. "This is ridiculous. We've invested in this property. We've made it better." "You made unauthorized changes to a property you don't own," my father interjected, his voice carrying the weight of paternal authority that even now, in our 30s, had the power to make us pause. "Using accounts and funds that weren't yours to access. In any other context, those actions would have consequences far more severe than an eviction notice." Heather turned to our mother, tears welling in her eyes. "Mom, are you going to let this happen? They're trying to make us homeless." It was the same playbook she had used successfully for decades, appeal to our mother's protective instincts, position herself as the victim, escalate emotionally until everyone backed down to keep the peace. I braced myself for the familiar pattern to unfold. But something unexpected happened. My mother, whose support Heather had clearly been counting on, shook her head slowly. "Heather, this isn't about making you homeless. This is about actions and consequences." Her voice was gentle but resolute. "We've looked at the evidence. The construction contracts with forged signatures. The enrollment forms for next year's school. The changes to the house without permission. These weren't misunderstandings or temporary solutions, these were deliberate choices to take something that wasn't yours." Heather's shock at not receiving her expected support quickly morphed into accusations. "You're all ganging up on me. You've always favored Stephanie. She has everything, the career, the money, this house, and I have nothing. Don't I deserve some happiness too?" "Of course you deserve happiness," I said, fighting to keep my voice steady. "But not at someone else's expense. Not by taking what isn't freely given." The conversation deteriorated quickly after that. Heather cycled through tears, rage, and attempts to divide our parents by appealing to old family dynamics. Mark alternated between aggressive defensiveness and suddenly remembering urgent calls he needed to make outside. It was exhausting and painfully familiar. Then, just as it seemed we were trapped in an endless cycle of accusation and denial, Emma and Liam returned from a neighbor's house. The adults fell silent as the children entered, immediately sensing the tension in the room. "Grandma! Grandpa!" Liam exclaimed, momentarily breaking the heaviness with his genuine delight. He rushed to hug them both before noticing the serious expressions. "What's wrong? Why does Mom look upset?" The question hung in the air, no adult immediately willing to explain the situation to a 10-year-old. To my surprise, it was my father who crouched down to Liam's level, his voice gentle but honest. "Your mom and Mark made some decisions that weren't theirs to make," he explained. "About living in this house that belongs to your Aunt Stephanie. Now we're having a grown-up conversation about fixing that mistake." "Are we in trouble?" Emma asked quietly, her eyes huge with worry. "Are we going to have to leave our home?" The word home struck me like a physical blow. This child, innocent in the adult's power struggle, had come to think of my property as her home. The unfairness of the situation, to her, to me, to everyone involved, suddenly crystallized with painful clarity. "This isn't your fault, Emma," I said, moving to kneel beside my father. "Not at all. But yes, you will need to find a new place to live. This house belongs to me, and while I love having you visit, it isn't yours to live in permanently." Heather made a choked sound, somewhere between a sob and a protest. "See what you're doing to them," she demanded. "They're just children. Children who are being taught that taking things without permission is acceptable," my mother replied with unexpected firmness. "What lesson does that teach them for the future, Heather?" The confrontation continued for hours, moving through painful revelations and old wounds. Mark admitted that their financial situation wasn't as dire as they had portrayed. They had money saved that could have gone toward housing, but they had chosen to use it for other expenses while taking advantage of the free accommodation. As the afternoon stretched into evening, a strange shift occurred. Perhaps exhausted by the emotional intensity, perhaps finally recognizing the inevitability of the outcome, Heather's defenses began to crack in a different way. For perhaps the first time in her adult life, she started to acknowledge the pattern of behavior that had led us to this breaking point. "I thought I was owed this," she admitted during a quiet moment. "After everything that went wrong in my marriage, in my career. I convinced myself that the universe owed me a break, and that you could afford to give it. I didn't think about what it was costing you." It wasn't a full apology, not yet, but it was the first genuine moment of reflection I had witnessed from her in years. My father, sensing the shift, suggested we continue the discussion over dinner, away from the charged environment of the house. The children went to stay with their grandparents at the hotel, giving the adults space to work through the painful details of the separation. Over the next 3 days, with our parents' mediation and Patricia's legal guidance, we hammered out a detailed agreement. Heather and Mark would vacate the property within 30 days. I would provide financial assistance for their fresh start, not out of obligation, but as a final act of familial support with clear boundaries attached. The unauthorized construction would be properly completed at their expense, with any additional restoration costs split between us. Most importantly, we established clear expectations for our relationship moving forward. There would be structured visitation times for the children at the beach house. Heather and I would attend joint therapy sessions to address our dysfunctional patterns. Our parents committed to supporting both daughters equally without enabling harmful behaviors. The paperwork was signed, the timeline established, and the boundaries set. When moving day came 3 weeks later, it was bittersweet. The children's tearful goodbyes to the house and neighborhood were painful to witness, but the apartment I had helped them secure was bright and modern, with a park nearby and good schools within walking distance. As I watched the moving truck pull away from Aunt Meredith's beach house, my beach house, I felt a complex mixture of emotions: relief, sadness, regret, and underneath it all, a tentative hope that perhaps this painful reset might eventually lead to something healthier for all of us. 1 year later, I stood on the wraparound porch of the beach house, morning coffee in hand, watching the sunrise over the distant Atlantic. The property had been restored to something that honored both Aunt Meredith's vision and my own evolving taste. The kitchen renovation, properly completed with my input, actually improved the flow of the space while maintaining the character I loved. The garden bloomed with a mixture of Meredith's beloved hydrangeas and my newly discovered passion for native coastal plants. After years of workaholic tendencies, I had finally embraced the concept of balance. My promotion had come through, but with boundaries I enforced rigorously. Weekends were sacred, with at least 2 per month spent at the beach house. I had learned to delegate effectively, to trust my team, and to recognize that constant accessibility was neither sustainable nor necessary for success. The relationship with my family had undergone its own renovation, more challenging and delicate than any construction project, but ultimately rewarding. The first 3 months after the eviction had been the hardest. Heather had vacillated between resentful silence and explosive accusations, making the mandated therapy sessions tense affairs that often ended in stalemate. But gradually, with the skilled guidance of our therapist Dr. Mercer, something shifted. Perhaps it was the stability of their new living situation, perhaps it was the clear consequences of crossed boundaries, or perhaps it was simply time allowing wounds to begin healing. Whatever the cause, Heather began to engage more honestly with the patterns that had defined our relationship since childhood. "I've spent my whole life in your shadow," she admitted during a particularly breakthrough session 6 months after the confrontation. "You were always the responsible one, the successful one, the one who had it all together. It was easier to resent you and take what I could get than to face my own choices. For my part, I had to acknowledge my role in our dysfunctional dynamic. My need to be the fixer, the responsible one, had enabled Heather's dependency as much as her actions had demanded it. My reluctance to establish and maintain clear boundaries had invited their violation. I thought loving you meant never saying no," I told her during that same session. "I thought being a good sister meant sacrificing whatever was asked of me. I was wrong, and that mistake hurt us both." Our parents, too, had engaged in their own reckoning. Our father acknowledged the different expectations he had set for his daughters, higher standards for me, more tolerance for Heather's mistakes. Our mother confronted her tendency to protect Heather from consequences at the expense of family harmony and my well-being. The children, resilient as only children can be, had adapted to their new environment more easily than the adults. Emma had joined an art program at their local community center, while Liam had connected with a science club at school that fueled his passion for marine biology. They visited the beach house 1 weekend each month, a schedule that provided consistency without the tension of unclear boundaries. Mark had found stable employment with a tech startup in Brooklyn, his talents finally matched with an organization that valued them appropriately. While he and I maintained a cordial but distant relationship, his improved financial situation and professional confidence had positively impacted his role in Heather's life and their partnership. As for Heather herself, the forced reset had ultimately catalyzed positive change. She had returned to school part-time, pursuing a degree in elementary education that aligned with her natural gifts for creativity and nurturing. Our relationship, while still healing, had found a new foundation built on honesty rather than obligation. The beach house, once the site of so much conflict, had been reclaimed as a place of healing. Family gatherings now took place with clear expectations and mutual respect. The space that had been violated was now protected by boundaries that everyone understood and honored. My own journey through this painful episode had taught me lessons I carried into every area of my life. I learned to recognize the difference between generosity and self-sacrifice, between helping and enabling. I discovered that love could be both kind and firm, that compassion didn't require the abandonment of personal boundaries. In professional settings, I became known for my clear communication and reasonable expectations, skills honed through the hardest personal experience of my life. My team flourished under leadership that modeled healthy boundaries and self-respect. New friendships blossomed in Southampton as I became part of the community Aunt Meredith had loved. Weekend beach cleanups, local fundraisers, and neighborhood gatherings filled my calendar with meaningful connections. The solitary workaholic began to discover the joy of balanced living. The property that had nearly been lost became the symbol of reclamation, not just of physical space, but of personal power and family healing. Aunt Meredith would have been proud, I think, not just of the preserved beauty of her beloved home, but of the growth it ultimately inspired in the niece who had inherited it. As I stood watching that sunrise, I reflected on the painful journey of the past 18 months. The betrayal had cut deeply, the confrontation had been excruciating, and the healing remained ongoing. Yet standing on the other side, I recognized that sometimes the hardest boundaries to establish are the ones most necessary for genuine love to flourish. Family, I had learned, was not an excuse for exploitation or an automatic right to access. True family connection required mutual respect, clear communication, and the understanding that love sometimes meant saying no for the right reasons. If you're facing your own boundary struggles with family or feeling taken advantage of by those closest to you, know that establishing healthy limits isn't selfish, it's necessary for authentic relationships to thrive. Have you ever had to make difficult decisions about boundaries with loved ones? Share your experience in the comments below, and don't forget to subscribe for more stories about family dynamics, personal growth, and the courage to reclaim your power. Remember that sometimes the hardest conversations lead to the most important healing, and that you deserve relationships built on mutual respect rather than obligation or guilt. Thank you for being part of this journey with me, and I wish you strength in your own path toward healthy boundaries and genuine connection.